Good evening, I'm Frank Stasio, host of The State of Things on North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, and I'm very happy to be here today, again this evening, and welcome you to Duke Reads. We're pleased to have Reynolds Price, Duke class of 1955, James B. Duke Professor of English here to discuss Virginia Woolf's To The Lighthouse. Professor Price is in his 52nd year of teaching at Duke, is well known as a teacher and a writer, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's written 38 books, the most recent, Ardent Spirits, a memoir about his time at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and his early years teaching here at Duke. Professor Price describes To The Lighthouse as one of the maybe 10 novels I most love in the world, and I love a great many. Professor Price, always a great pleasure.
Great to see you, Frank.
Great to see you. Let's get right to the first question. And because I know that we're going to find out why in the course of our discussion you find this one of your 10 favorite novels. Why is it often difficult to read this book in its prose and in its meanings?
Well, I think that probably syntactically, the grammar, the word order, etc., are sometimes obscure. The sentences are very long occasionally, longer than is usual for Woolf. She didn't specialize in writing obscure prose. She was interested in being accessible to as many people as possible. So I think in the case of To The Lighthouse, because it was going to be about, ultimately, her own family, and especially about her very beloved mother, she just wanted to pack into it everything she knew how to do, and then to proceed to do it at her best. And as you know, Frank, she had mental problems essentially all her adult life, from late adolescence right on until such a bout of the problem caused her to commit suicide when she was a woman in her early 50s. But I think it would be highly inaccurate to think of Virginia Woolf as an insane person. She was a person who was visited at certain intervals by periods of mental derangement. And she'd go off, and very luckily for her, one of the gifts of God in her life, although she wasn't especially into enumerating God's gifts, was that she met, as a relatively young woman, she met what she called a very intelligent Jew. She liked to use the word Jew. It wasn't one of her favorite kinds of human being. And when she first met Leonard Woolf, I don't think she had the faintest idea she was going to marry him, and that he was going to make her life possible for many more years thereafter, which he did. He was an economist. He was a sort of anthropologist. He was a number of things. He'd gone to Cambridge. And he became absolutely indispensable to Virginia's sanity, her writing, a great deal else.
She, well, I just want to get this in too from Joanne, and of course we invite your comments on all of our questions and any other observations or questions you might have. Joanne says on this question of the difficulty of the prose, that one long paragraph can consist of only a few sentences. So I think she's just simply making the observation that you know, it tends to go on. But it's an experiment, isn't it? I mean, she's really experimenting with something that might come to be called stream of consciousness. I don't know if it was at the time, and I don't know how many others writers were doing it. Joyce, obviously, but before this was published in 1927.
Right.
But it's a great experiment, and it seems to me a successful one in probing the way the mind really works.
I think it is, yeah. I must have read it, 4 or 5 times straight through. There are times when I pick it up and read 4 or 5 pages, but I've read the whole thing at least 4 or 5 times, and every time I read it, there are moments when I feel a little balked by the complexity of certain passages. But I think I see why they're complex when they are so. And I don't think she did it in any sense to make herself look unusually gifted. I think she did it because the material was so complex that she couldn't write about it in subject, verb, object sentences. So basically, I think that the prose is extraordinarily, I wouldn't say simple, extraordinarily lucid for Virginia Woolf.
Well, she seemed to have control of it. I think that's it. We call that, we call it stream of consciousness, and it's generally used as some kind of an insult when we're sort of listening to someone try to spit it out. But it takes a great deal of control, doesn't it, to blend the ordinary thoughts that are going through your mind at a time when we're trying to make conversation. There's that great, she's walking with her husband, right, and she's trying to console him. At the same time, she's worried about the rabbits. And are they rabbits or was it moles? Now it's been a while. And so that's going through her mind while she's grabbing his arm and trying to console him. But that is how we do things, Exactly. It's, I've got to get to the post office, and Reynolds is here, and Right. And she does it with great control. Here's one of my favorite paragraphs, if you will indulge me for just a moment, because it seems to me that one of the things I noticed about this book is that anything that was objective seemed to be subjunctive. It was a subordinate clause, and that what was the main clause was a feeling or an emotion. So here's a great. She's wondering whether or not Nancy had gone on this trip down to the moor or down to the water, and it's all mental activity. She's thinking about it, right, Mrs. Ramsay? Well, then, Nancy had gone with them, Mrs. Ramsay supposed, wondering as she put down a brush, took up a comb, and said, "Come in," to the tap of the door. Jasper and Rose came in. So all the things that happened in that scene are subordinate. Wondering whether, in fact, Nancy had made it less likely, or whether, in fact, that Nancy was with them made it less likely or more likely that anything would happen. It made it less likely somehow, Mrs. Ramsay felt very intentionally, except that, after all, the Holocaust on such a scale was not probable. Yeah. It's tough sledding, to sort through that. But it seems to me that she's making a statement about the power of emotion to drive our action and our, to be front and center when the stuff we're doing is apparently more important, but in fact sometimes subordinate to how we feel about things.
Well, I think she's writing a book which cannot be read adequately when one is planning tomorrow night's dinner for 4 guests, or when one's going to have to walk down to the British Museum this afternoon and buy postcards to send to certain nice people in America who've written to her. She was a woman who found it hard to do 2 things at once. I've always been terrible at it, so I take some comfort in knowing that Virginia Woolf had at least as much trouble with it as I do.
She warns, by the way, along those lines, toward the end of the book, it was great because I wrote in the margin, busted. There was something about reading very quickly, Mr. Ramsay. This is like page 203, so we're 3 pages in the end. He was reading very quickly, as if he were eager to get to the end. And I thought, that's her joke, isn't it? She's telling us all to slow down. It goes on from there, but it's wonderful. This idea that these things do take time to absorb and try to make sense of.
And she keeps trying to tell you, quite courteously, that you are reading something that deserves your full attention. Yeah.
And at least a couple of readings. Let's go to the second question. As always, we invite your questions and comments as well. This interim passage about the moving of time in the lives of the characters and central places, is it effective or is it disturbingly fancy or over-elaborate? What do you think?
Where are you?
Well, your second question here. This interim passage now, sort of the second chapter. First chapter is, and then we have the second chapter when we have simply the passage of time.
Right.
And this kind of 10 years passes in
time
that short.
Passes.
And it's called
Yeah.
Time Passes. And your question was, is she kind of faking it up here? Is it a little too fancy, overwrought, or was there something to it?
I really don't think it is, because I think what she's faced by, what she's confronted with here, and on several other occasions in the novel, is the passage of sizable lumps of time. Because if you're writing a novel that you hope to be a good book about a family's vacation cottage at the shore, as they would say, not the beach, at the shore, then it's difficult to do, because you don't rent the house out between times.
Right.
And when you finally get there yourselves, then you've also planned in a way that I recognize from my own childhood and activities of my parents at Virginia Beach and Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. And you invited as many of your loved ones as you could pack into a single dwelling. And they had sleeping bags and God knows what, hammocks on the porch. And one or two people came along, generally, wives or husbands, and sort of parallel, but not actual blood kin. And but nonetheless, you found ways to fit them in,
Right.
send them off to get a loaf of bread, and tell them to stay quite a while. But I think she's wonderful at, and Mrs. Ramsay doesn't really seem to mind having this big house full of people. She seems like the kind of person who would really resent that, but we're basically not told that she does. She feels a bit overloaded at times, but my God, who wouldn't?
Right.
Yeah.
But her attention to detail, the dinner party, I think that's a pretty good evidence that those simple little things are the thing. And over-against her highly intellectual and needy husband, whose goal in life is to get to Q, whatever that is. And it turns out.
Gardens at Kew, yeah. I never met him. He lived on way into my own years in England, which were the mid to late 1950s. And two of my very close friends when I lived in England were Stephen Spender, the poet, and Lord David Cecil, the biographer and critic. And they had known Virginia very well when she was alive. And then they saw a lot of Leonard then. And after Virginia's death, then they saw a lot of Leonard and found him a much more likable man than they had realized he was going to be, because he always stood back when the real Bloomsburys were there.
Yeah, right. But her father too. I mean, and of course, I think that's the case here, where she's writing about her father. She does not seem sympathetic. In fact, let me ask you about that. If there's a criticism, it might be that he's a bit cardboard. He seems to be a kind of caricature.
Yeah.
He's just quintessentially, sort of hopelessly male, and needs affirmation and intellectual to the point that he's, sort of useless in the real world.
I don't feel that that's a failure of characterization, because he's not that central an element in the emotional connotation of the novel. But I think that she makes him real enough and sympathetic enough to what he perceives as being his wife's problems.
Yeah.
So.
Well, here's what Joanne has to say about that second question, this interim passage, time passes. I think the passage is effective, Joanne says, although it didn't hold my interest as well as the other two. This technique allows the author to cover time and events quickly and in a unique way through the use of parentheses. The readers learn about the family members' deaths, activities more rapidly than if Mrs. Ramsay had continued as the main source of the observations and information. And the passage provides a transition to the third section that is told mostly through the eyes of Lily Briscoe. It sure does. Talk about parenthetical statements. A figure as large as Mrs. Ramsay dies after a comma, as an afterthought, having died suddenly.
No.
What was she doing there? I mean, that's obvious. She's in great control of this work.
She knew what she was doing.
Yeah.
She accomplished her purpose. Are we sufficiently satisfied by the way Mrs. Ramsay? I've always sort of hated the American tendency to avoid the word dead.
Yeah.
People say she passed away.
Yeah.
And I think she passed where? Did she pass in the passing lane or what?
Right.
And but Mrs. Stephen, Virginia's mother, had died. And Virginia was still a very young woman, wasn't she?
Yeah.
I'm not even sure she'd yet turned 20. But she had to process this and have her father around, a man whose whole life was dedicated to preserving the biographies of people older than themselves, famous Victorians, in this large series of books. I guess she's fair to him.
Yeah. And it seems to me, again, this is another example of the objective action happening almost parenthetically, because the figure of Mrs. Ramsay is going to loom large in this book. She remains alive. She's resurrected, and in fact, that Lily, for me, draws her strength and actually puts the mark on the canvas.
Absolutely.
When she can reflect on this life. So the life is still among us, and that's why I think it's easy enough to say, having died suddenly, that the physical death of this woman is the point, and she's. I mean, we'll get to the question of this image of the lighthouse. I mean, was it overwrought? Do you think it was overdone?
No, I certainly don't. It has to bear so much weight in the book.
Yeah.
It's practically the very first thing that's mentioned in the book. And it goes straight through to the end. It's the passionate goal of so many of the characters.
Right.
I think she made it work.
Yeah. It's a powerful image. And again, this business of what she foregrounds and what's in the background. And,
I know.
And light isn't that it? I mean, in the sunlight, we're bathed in it, so we don't see the light, but you see the shaft of light in the darkness. So it's by creating this contrast and then asking yourself, what's the reality and what's the silhouette?
Yeah.
I can't think of a better image than a lighthouse. I'm going to adjust my microphone with your indulgence.
Nor a more dangerous image in the sense that it could have turned into if she had just pressed 1 gram of excess weight on the image,
Right.
it would have been so corny, wouldn't it?
That's it exactly.
There's a lighthouse. Here comes the thief. And everybody faced the light and smile.
Yeah.
But she avoids that somehow.
Yeah.
She had extraordinary taste, in the best sense of that.
Well, and
maligned word.
Yeah, and what strikes me is, again, she's experimenting with this thing that's become pretty common now, and people can sort of imitate it these days, this stream of consciousness kind of writing. And there are plenty of examples of bad imitations, but she's on the cutting edge here. Yeah. She's in the advance guard and maintains this control that I found pretty exciting. And again, this sort of union of opposites that is present throughout the book. This is one of my favorite passages, and with your indulgence, I'll read it. Because it's first of all, she has her son literally between his legs, and he's in competition. I'm assuming she has read Freud by now. So, who's by the way a new thinker, turn of the 20th century, and she's sort of absorbing that.
One of their best friends, one of the Strachey's, translated Freud from German into English. Yeah.
So So of course.
Yeah.
So now literally her son is between, she's telling him a story, and along comes Mr. Ramsay needing reinforcement. He's a failure as a philosopher. Mrs. Ramsay, who had been sitting loosely, folding her son in her arm, braced herself and, half turning, seemed to raise herself with an effort and at once to pour erect into the air a rain of energy, a column of spray, looking at the same time animated and alive, as if all her energies were being fused into force, burning and illuminating. Quietly, though she sat, taking up her stocking again, and into this delicious fecundity, this fountain and spray of life, the fatal sterility of the male plunged itself like a beak of brass, barren and bare. That's some good writing.
I know. And
Wow.
she's really, walking this tightrope so delicately, and yet never signals to you that she's afraid of what she's doing.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all these male images of fertility that she can impute to her heroine, and then the male does insert his beak, but it's a sterile. It's ingenious, I think. And again, anything that was objective, the knitting and the stocking, all in parentheses, and this spray. My goodness, what is that? It wasn't happening, was it? And yet that's the imagery that takes the foreground. Should we move on to your third question?
Sure.
Would you, as its author, have kept Mrs. Ramsay alive to the end of the book? What's gained by her dying when she does?
Well, what do you think? Would you? It would have certainly been a great temptation, wouldn't it?
Yeah, because you assume that she's the heroine, or the protagonist.
Yeah.
And in some way, I mean, we could get into this question too, whether or not Lily is the protagonist or whether it's Mrs. Ramsay. But it's precisely keeping her alive after her physical death that is, I think, one of the great themes of the book.
I do too.
I mean, and unless she goes in the middle of the book, and only parenthetically, does that trick work?
Yeah.
Because she's everybody keeps coming back to her. They keep referring to her. Their salty tears cried 10 years after her death in that empty house. That's the thing that allows Lily to put the brush to the canvas.
Exactly.
So I can't imagine that. Let's see what Joanne has to say. I believe the book works with Mrs. Ramsay's dying before the end of the book because Mr. Ramsay is then allowed to play a greater role. I hadn't thought of that. Earlier, he was less involved, seemed to postpone the visit to the lighthouse, whereas at the end, he initiates the trip with his daughter and son. Following their initial reluctance, the children appear to bond to their father. Once they reach the lighthouse, the bonding might not have occurred if Mrs. Ramsay were still alive, especially since she was so protective of James. And that's an interesting interpretation. Did they bond? How did you feel about that at the end? I don't know if I felt that.
I wonder how my readers feel about that, because it is. I had a character, a female character, much like Mrs. Ramsay in a lot of ways, and she had been part of a 3-novel sequence. Mm-hmm. 3 novels about the same family. And she gets into the 3rd novel, and I really thought that she was going to die a little bit before the middle point of that book. Hell, I wanted to get her out of the way and let some of the others come forward a little more thrustingly. But she didn't want to die. She wouldn't really let herself be trundled off to the funeral home. And so I put up with her all the way to the end. The guy at the funeral home, when I talked with him about it, he was very intelligent and very willing to listen to me and say to me the things that he thought I needed to hear. And one of those things was that almost nobody dies when we really want them to. So Mrs. Ramsay goes, as you pointed out a minute ago, she goes a little bit earlier than we thought she would, and goes, as you say, in a kind of parenthesis. But nonetheless, she's gone, and however ready you realize you were to have her go, I think there's a little bit of,
Oh, yeah.
oh my God, this,
Now what?
this woman is gone, yeah.
Do you think, I mean, what Joanne was suggesting here was that Mr. Ramsay sort of takes a larger role, but he doesn't seem to come into himself any better. He doesn't seem to be any more secure to me, or any more alive or out of his own head.
I don't think so either.
He's still
no.
living inside his head. And,
He's very self-absorbed, yeah.
And even though he manages to compliment his son and give him some praise for his boatsmanship,
Yeah.
which is the first time he's done that, little James is still not ready to accept his father. They're still pretty resentful. And you sort of feel sorry for James in the end. You're hoping he will come into his own, but now he's as judgmental and, as it seems to me, limited as his father. He's really picked that up, and kind of thinking, she worked hard to keep that from happening, but it didn't seem to take.
It is a problem, you know. Of course, when you've had someone around for 75 years, it's awfully hard to trundle them off.
Yeah.
But I trundled my woman away, and I think when I went back and read the whole trilogy all over again last summer, I realized that it was right to do what I did. That I got her well out of the way, and I got her out.
Did the other characters fill in? Did they sort of take their
I think they did.
Carry their weight?
I think they did, and I think that the one or two of them who did need to step forward and blossom a little more did so, and did so credibly. But you never know.
When you write, do you consciously begin with a form, or have you ever? You've written a number of novels, obviously, and in different styles. Do you start with a form, a style, intentionally, or does that emerge based on the characters and the theme?
Frank, I start with a story.
Mm-hmm.
X is going to run away with Y against her parents' better wishes and not come home for quite a while. And so it happens that way in the book, as it happened that way in my father's family. His sister, Mary Eleanor Price, in Warrenton, ran away with a young man whose last name was Grant, and they ran off to eastern North Carolina, around Elizabeth City, and took up there and got themselves married. And someone at the railway station, my grandfather, Rodwell, he was, got a telegram the day after she ran away from Macon, North Carolina. Granddad got a telegram from the station master in this little village saying, Mary Eleanor just stopped over here for 2 hours and got married. is there anything you want to know, need to know, anything that I could telegraph the next stop in line to try to get them persuaded to get. Do you want us to try to get them off the train?
Yeah.
Do you want us to return them to
Right.
what in essence was Raleigh, North Carolina?
Right.
So I tried to pull back and withdraw from my aunt's life as definitively as I could,
Right.
because I had learned all of this really from asking questions of living members of the family who had seen it all happen. My own dad was gone, but there were other members who were conscious of how it really did shatter the family to have it happen as it did. But
When you've come up with the fictional version of this story, obviously you're not writing a family history now. This is not, and you have a larger point to make. Does that become more? And I'm thinking about you and Virginia Woolf as well. Obviously, she loved her mother deeply. She worshipped her mother, and yet she had a lot else to say. This was not simply about domestic life in the Hebrides. How difficult is that to use people you love and respect to then try to make a bigger point?
I think it's damn difficult.
Yeah.
And fascinating. If I were simply going to be telling what I thought really happened, I think it would get boring pretty fast for me, and maybe 5 other people in our family or in the village who might have known her. But she was gone by the time the book was published, so she didn't have to deal with
Right.
anything that was painful for her. But it was the first time I had ever done that in any of my work. And I was a man by then. I was a man in my early 60s. And it was pretty bold of me to do what I did.
I would say so.
And she never mentioned to me that she had read it or that she was glad I did it or unglad that I did. I never knew. She lived 3 or 4 more years. And clearly the book stayed in the living room coffee table the whole time. And she obviously read those passages. Bound to have
Scandal enough, I would think, for a Southern family to have a woman run off with a man named Grant. That by itself, it seems to me, is the grist for a trilogy. Let's talk a little bit more about this, though, and maybe staying with that very theme, because it strikes me, this is going to be my interpretation of one of the main themes in this thing, and I'm happy to hear from anybody else. Virginia Woolf seems to be talking about the power of love itself to transcend those little details that are parenthetical and subordinate. And maybe that's how she did it. Maybe that's how she was able to talk about big themes and her mother in the same book, because they were one and the same. It was about love, and her mother got that a lot better than her father, who kept thinking that the answer was somehow in his head, and if only he could get to Q, all of humankind's problems would be solved. And you have her. Isn't it wonderful that the first word in this book is yes? It's this larger-than-life affirmation, yes. Mrs. Ramsay said, but you'll have to be up with the lark, which is a wonderful word.
Yeah.
Yes only worked. We can affirm that, yes, we can get there tomorrow, but you can't be skittering around here on terra firma. You've got to be up there. So it's a powerful theme, and that brings us to Lily, who's the artist. What, in your mind, was Lily, Virginia Woolf, was that a kind of alter ego for the writer herself?
I don't really think so. I think that Virginia was probably intellectually more accomplished than Lily.
Mm-hmm.
She'd certainly read more than Lily, though Lily's a well-informed person. Nonetheless, I think that I don't think we should
Right.
think that Virginia is consumed by Lily.
Right.
No.
But art and
Though I
the
love Lily, I think she's one of my 2 or 3 favorite characters in the book. Yeah.
but it seems to me that the role of art and the role of the artist is certainly one of the things that Virginia Woolf is interested in this book.
Absolutely. And she's trying to answer those questions primarily for herself.
Yeah.
I mean, who the hell else would she be trying to answer them for? And she's trying to find out what the artist, in our case the novelist, owes the world for his gift.
And how you access that.
Yeah.
Lily seems almost incapable of getting things started. It seems to me until she comes to terms with Mrs. Ramsay's death, until she accepts that and embraces that as part of the human condition. And that seems to be an important point. And feminists will rally to this book as well, because it clearly is sort of a pushback against men who say that women have no part and shouldn't be dabbling in this field.
I wish somehow feminism could have come in for more pressure towards the end of the book. She could have told us more about her views about the triumph of women.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose she just must have felt, and probably felt quite rightly, that it was a very dangerous path to wander off on. And so she gave it very little time, just a meeting in Cambridge, and left it. Let us know what her involvement might have been, but then got on with ending the book. Yeah.
Right. Eventually you have to get this thing off to the publisher.
Yeah.
Well, feminism, but also it's interesting too. Mrs. Ramsay, who we really come to adore in this book, is really pushing family. She's getting everybody married. That's what she's all about. I mean, how does that square with this sort of the way feminists would embrace Virginia Woolf? The idea that by marriage we mean a man and a woman marry. And this is the union that I'm promoting.
It's very surprising, I think.
Yeah.
We don't think of Virginia Woolf as pushing the having of babies,
Yeah.
because God knows she had none of her own. And yet here she is in this novel telling us about, at 1 or 2 points, the life of babies in the uterus, and sort of what this is like, the little bumping around of the baby down there.
Is it? I went. This little passage and passages like it made me wonder if there wasn't something a little bit more to this. That yes, marriage is a fine institution. So, but it's also a symbol of something larger. Mrs. Ramsay, for one, this is page 51. It was not knowledge, but unity that she desired, not inscriptions on tablets, nothing that could be written in any language known to men, but intimacy itself, which knowledge, she had thought, leaning her head on Mrs. Ramsay's knee. The idea that this sort of union of things, bringing things together, not the fragmentation that sort of Western intellectual tradition does, just putting things in categories and analyzing, but it's synthesizing. And if anything, Mrs. Ramsay represented that kind of synthesis over and against the analysis of her overwrought and undernourished husband. you know, how you feel about that, whether she was getting it more a question of synthesis than talking strictly about the institution of marriage.
And we don't really know, do we, what the Ramsey, male and female, what the Ramsey sex life is like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How satisfactory it is to each one of them. I think we have every reason to think that it's probably gratifying, but we're not really told how it's gratifying.
No, although interesting, the only way we know anything about them, their identity is in relationship to each other. They are Mr. Ramsay and Mrs. Ramsay. They don't get first names. They don't get their own name. They're identified in relationship to each other.
Exactly.
So clearly there's a respect for that. We asked the question earlier about the lighthouse itself, whether it was too obvious a symbol. Joanne weighed in and said, "I fear I missed the obvious symbol of the lighthouse. It did provide a destination point for the family, and a watchful light similar to Mrs. Ramsay, and was the goal and a constant throughout the story. I felt it was a credible lighthouse. Could you discuss the symbolism? Talk about the many ways that the lighthouse plays a part."
Gosh. Well, it's amazing that she manages to talk about it as much as she does without, I truly think, without becoming too obviously experimental, too obviously. I mean, there's the wonderful whole chapter which that begins on page 145 that really takes up the meaning of the lighthouse for a good many people.
Yeah.
Chaos approached. She could not paint. She stooped, she turned, she took up this rag. She squeezed that too, but all she did was to ward him off a moment. It made it impossible for her to do anything, for she gave him the least chance. If he saw her disengaged, a moment, looking his way, a moment, he would be on the chart, be on her, saying, as he had said last night, "You find us much changed." Last night he had got up and stopped before her and said that, dumb and staring, though they had all sat, the 6 children whom they used to call after the kings and queens of England, the red, the fair, the wicked, the ruthless. She felt how they raged under it. Kind old Mrs. Beckwith said something sensible, but it was a house full of unrelated passions. She had felt that all the evening, and on top of this chaos, Mr. Ramsay got up, pressed her hand, and said, "You will find us much changed." And none of them had moved or spoken, but had sat there as if they were forced to let him say it. And that goes on quite a while. It was a wonderful night, starlit. The waves sounded as they went upstairs. The moon surprised them enormous pale as they passed the staircase window. She had slept at once. Yeah.
Yeah, it's as you pointed out, and as Joanne said, it's a destination. It's a force of change, also constant. I mean,
Yeah.
there's the strobe quality, but there it is. It's
Yeah.
on this rock, a rock in the water. So,
And
I mean,
it's
there's all that great.
big.
Yeah.
It's not just a little lighthouse. It's out there and it's big. And yeah, I think, and the lighthouse keeper himself,
Right.
is a big man when he comes down and stands by them on the shore. He's someone who, is deeply imposing.
Yeah, he demands our attention for sure. Let's move on to the last question now. What does Lily Briscoe bring us in the final pages, and what does the completion of her picture and her vision add to this book's considerable freight of gifts? Professor Price.
Professor Stasio, whatever. Let me see my question. Have you got it there?
I do.
Yeah,
I do.
I should remember it
It's
more
number
better than I
5.
do.
We're talking about Lily,
Yeah.
and she finishes the picture, and
I think that she brings us, however briefly and succinctly, she brings us but she doesn't have it in her to go on and on and on the way Mrs. Ramsay might do, the way that Mr. Ramsay, God knows, would have done. But she really is the person who has known Mrs. Ramsay long enough and well enough to be able to tell us a great deal about what this woman got out of all her children and about little James.
yeah, and she
I
finishes.
can't imagine us having the novel without her.
No,
without that
no. Well, here's a
final
Joanne.
couple of pages,
Here's Joanne.
And I still, Frank, I still can wake up in the night, or especially a moonlit night when it's coming in my windows, I can still wake up and think, oh my God, Lily Briscoe and the moon and the lighthouse. And
So moved were you that in your book, A Whole New Life by Reynolds Price, you write, the unseen, you were talking about doctors who had been your doctors through many of your ordeals. Doctors' superb craft and technical judgment, whatever their faults of attention and sympathy, ousted a lethal thing from my spine. Other resourceful attendants nursed me through pitch-black nights of roaring pain. An annual lot of intelligence students throws down the welcome gauntlet to me. Give us all you've got, no discount for pain. The unseen hand of the source of all that is never felt absent as long as a week, and I shall sense a holiday painter as she finishes her canvas at the end of Virginia Woolf's To The Lighthouse. I have had my vision. Mine was a vision of healing that has remained in force for a decade full, at least, of work. So clearly, this had great meaning to you.
I wrote that years before I wrote what we're talking about tonight.
Mm-hmm. There's a nice passage in this book, too, that I think talks about, because there's so many sort of spiritual concepts that I think Virginia Woolf tackles, the concept of love, the things that we don't see, the thought process she takes on, intangible, and yet Lily has to get on with the business of representing this. It's one thing to live it, to influence other people's lives as Mrs. Ramsay has, but can I reflect it? Can I interpret it for other people? That's the artist's role. And so here we go with Lily. She had taken the wrong brush in her agitation at Mr. Ramsay's presence, and her easel rammed into the earth so nervously it was at the wrong angle, and now she had to put it right, and in doing so had subdued the impertinences and irrelevances that plucked her attention and made her remember how she was such and such a person and such relations to people. And she took her hand and she raised the brush, and for a moment it stayed, trembling in a painful but exciting ecstasy in the air. Where to begin? That was the question. At what point to make the mark first? One line placed on the canvas committed her to innumerable risks, to frequent and irrevocable decisions. All that in an idea seems simple and practical and immediately complex, as the waves shape themselves symmetrically from the cliff top, but to the swimming among them were divided by steep gulfs, foaming crests. Still, The risk must be run. The mark must be made. Is it? It's,
Don't you wish you'd
I wish I had written it. I'm glad I read it.
Yeah,
I mean, there's
exactly,
that. But the
exactly.
power that's finally this influence of Mrs. Ramsay to take the stab, and commit, the idea that first mark commits you to, and as a writer, you probably feel, I mean,
Yeah.
you tell students, get something on the page, and then you're not writing or editing,
Exactly.
Get past that initial fear, which had been troubling her from the start. I mean, she
know.
just couldn't put that mark in the
I
canvas.
asked Lord David Cecil, who saw a good deal of Virginia when he was a young man in his 20s, and I said, did you know her when she was writing To The Lighthouse? And he said, I did, but she wrote it without discussing it at all with us. And then he said, she got down to the end and got very close to the ending. And he said she seemed to sail right on through it. And eventually I asked her if she could tell us anything about the ending. And he said she laughed, and she had a wonderful laugh apparently. And she said, oh my gosh, I could never do that. And I think he thought it would be a very American thing for her to do. But anyway, she said, well, maybe I'll think of it later. And when they finished with their dessert, and mousse, she suddenly looked up at them and just said, what if I read it to you? And she reached over behind her on the table and picked up 4 or 5 pages and read it off. And he said, we were as moved as we should have been.
Wow. Joanne also weighed in on this question, number 5, what Lily brings to this. A sense of finality to the book. She had watched the Ramsays from the beginning. She heard Mrs. Ramsay's desire to take the family to the lighthouse. In the end, Lily watches the boat finally carrying Mr. Ramsay, the remaining Ramsays, to the lighthouse. Lily paints her picture, reflects on Mrs. Ramsay and the family's interactions. Lily seems to come to an understanding of the family, attains completion of her painting, and the novel ends with closure. Lily's completion of her painting is like an exclamation point at the end of the novel. Well said. I think that's...
Absolutely.
Who's the protagonist in this? Is it Lily?
Who's the protagonist?
Is it Lily or is it Mrs. Ramsay?
Lily, I think.
Yeah. That's interesting.
You could do without I guess you could do without Mrs. Ramsay as an acting character. So people could remember her and so forth. But Lily does have to be there. Mr. Ramsay would also need to be there. She's very central.
I guess that's why I had this feeling and I take your point about Virginia Woolf obviously being more accomplished and probably more confident in some ways than Lily. But the relationship between Lily as someone who had it in her but couldn't get it out of her, except for the influence of Mrs. Ramsay. And then you think about Virginia Woolf and thinking about her role. I have to reflect. I'm the artist now.
Yeah.
I can't just be the glue that holds a family together the way my loving mother did. I've got this job to do. I've got these books to write, and I gotta put that first sentence down. And I know darn well it commits me to the last sentence, which is the one you all kind of worry. That's the one you all worry about, isn't it? That getting to that last.
And many, many times I have gone to a blank sheet of paper and written the final 2 or 3 sentences of the book. And I've never written them down yet without getting them right. They always turn out to be the last 3 or 4 sentences of the book. Though I've sometimes, by the time I get there, I've sort of forgotten what they are. But I'm very relieved to have them waiting for me, and I haven't done that yet with the book I'm currently working on, but I imagine I will soon.
Have you ever started with the end?
No, never
No,
have. No.
I always felt like for great writers like you, it's got to be a little like laying rail lines and trying to get the, going west to east and east to west.
Very
When you
tricky,
meet
yeah, absolutely.
Reynolds, what a great pleasure. Professor Price,
you,
so good to talk with you.
Great
Thank
to be
you
with
so
you
much.
always.
Reynolds Price, Duke Reads, a conversation is always a delight, and thank you for joining us today. For those in our audience, a reminder that this session is going to be available on Ustream and YouTube and iTunes. So there's a couple U's and an I. That's about it. Next session is going to be March 17th. Michael Malone will be here. He's going to discuss The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett. Please send your comments and questions in advance. Also, let me remind you, Friday, March 5th, tune into Ustream for office hours at noon Eastern Time with Duke Professor Timur Kuran, who will take questions live online from viewers about Islamic finance. All of that, and we will see you next time, March 17th. Michael Malone, Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. Thanks very much. Good night.